Get out and die. That was the scream that shattered my soul. My father, Leopold, left to rot in his own waste on the marble I paid for, while my sister Vesta smirked behind a glass of my vintage wine. I'm Andrew, and I didn't just gift my parents $1 million mansion. I accidentally built them a slaughterhouse. I blink, the violent red haze of my thoughts finally dissolving into the gray, misty reality of the coastline as the mansion's iron gates swing open. The salt air of Charleston usually carries the scent of renewal, but as I turned my sedan onto the long, oak-lined driveway of the mansion, the breeze felt heavy, almost stagnant. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale, feeling the weight of 15 years of relentless labor in the glass towers of Boston. Every late-night brief I'd written, every high-stakes litigation I'd won, it was all for this moment. I had built this neoclassical sanctuary to be a temple of peace for my parents, Leopold and Adelaide. They deserved a sunset of dignity, far away from the cramped, drafty apartments of my childhood. As the white pillars of the estate came into view, bathed in the amber glow of a South Carolina sunset, I felt a swell of pride. But as I parked, the pride curdled into a cold, intuitive knot in my stomach. The vibration of wrongness hit me before I even turned off the engine. The flower beds I'd paid to be manicured were choked with weeds. The porch light flickered with a rhythmic, dying stutter. There were no sounds of laughter, no smell of my mother's roast chicken, no music playing for their 50th wedding anniversary. Silence is a dangerous thing in a house that was built for celebration. I stepped out of the car, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. The flowers my mother always said reminded her of grace. I adjusted my tie, trying to shake the dread. A house, after all, is just a skeleton of wood and stone. It is the heartbeat of the people inside that gives it a soul. I've always believed that success isn't measured by the height of the marble pillars we build, but by the safety of those sheltered within them. Have you ever walked into a place you loved, only to realize the air had been stolen from the rooms? I reached the front door and used my master key. The lock turned with a dry, neglected click. As the door swung open, I wasn't met with the surprise I had imagined for months. Instead, a wave of stale air, the stench of unwashed linens, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear hit me like a physical blow. Then, I heard it, a muffled, wet sob coming from the grand foyer. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped onto the Italian marble. This was the floor I had hand-selected for its purity, yet now it was streaked with filth and dried grime. I looked down and the breath left my lungs. My father, Leopold, a man who once carried me on his shoulders with the strength of a titan, was lying in the middle of the hallway. He was covered in his own waste, his clothes tattered, his body trembling with the shivers of a neglected fever. The lilies slipped from my hand. They scattered across the dirty marble, their white petals instantly stained by the rot on the floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the mess, and pulled him into my arms. Dad, it's Andrew. I'm here. I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. He looked at me, and it wasn't the pain that killed me. It was the shame in his eyes. He tried to pull away, to hide his state, his dignity shattering in my hands. Dignity is a fragile thing. It takes a lifetime to build and only a moment of calculated cruelty to shatter. Looking back now, I should have seen the shadows lengthening over my family, but I was too busy building walls to notice who I had left to guard the gate. A piercing scream erupted from the sunroom, followed by a crash of glass. I eased my father back down, my blood turning to liquid ice. I sprinted toward the sound, my shoes skidding on the grime. I burst through the French doors to find a scene of pure, unadulterated malice. Mordecai, my brother-in-law, had his thick hands bunched in my mother's sweater. He was violently shoving her toward an open window, his face contorted with a feral rage. "Get out, you useless old woman! Die already!" he bellowed. My sister, Vesta, didn't move to help. She was leaning against the staircase, swirling a glass of the vintage 1974 Bordeaux I had sent ahead for the anniversary. She watched the struggle with a bored, clinical smirk, as if she were watching a stray cat being shooed from a porch. In that moment, the realization hit me with the force of a gavel. She hadn't just stolen the money I sent. She was trying to erase our parents' humanity so she could inherit the shell they left behind. "Let her go," I said. My voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrating growl that stopped Mordecai in his tracks. He spun around, his eyes widening as he saw me standing there, a shadow in the doorway. He sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "Well, if it isn't the golden boy. You're late for the party, Andrew." He went to shove Adelaide again, but I moved with a professional speed that caught him off guard. I didn't throw a punch. That would be too simple. I caught his wrist in a firm, legal grip, applying just enough pressure to the nerves to make his hand go limp. I pulled my mother behind me, her small frame shaking so violently I could feel her teeth chattering. Vesta finally spoke, her voice smooth and dripping with poison. "You're a tourist here, Andrew. You bought the house, but we're the ones who live here. We're the ones who endure them." She stepped down a stair, her heels clicking like a countdown. "By the way, you're trespassing. I have a residency agreement. Get out before I have Mordecai call the police on you for breaking and entering." I looked at the woman who shared my blood and saw nothing but a stranger wearing a mask of greed. "I built these walls to keep the world out, Vesta," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm even as my knuckles whitened. I didn't realize the wolves were already inside. I reached out and wrapped my tailored wool coat around my mother, kissing her forehead. I looked her in the eyes and made a silent vow. "This is the last minute you will ever feel afraid in this house, Mom. I promise you." I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands didn't shake. I looked at Mordecai, then at Vesta, and dialed 911. My thumb hovered over the call button. I knew that once I pressed it, the bridge back to the family I thought I had would be burned to ash. But as I looked at the filth on the floor and the bruise forming on my mother's arm, I realized that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands by you when the lights go out. Have you ever reached a point where you realize that peace requires a war? The dispatcher's voice in my ear was a tether to a world that still made sense. But inside the foyer of the Charleston mansion, sense had been replaced by a sickening theater of the absurd. As I kept my gaze fixed on my mother, shielding her frail body with my own, I watched Vesta and Mordecai transform. It wasn't just a shift in mood, it was a professional-grade execution of a lie. Before the first siren even wailed in the distance, Vesta's fingers became talons. She raked them across her own cheek, drawing thin, angry beads of blood. Mordecai, eyes wide with a manic determination, grabbed a heavy porcelain vase, a housewarming gift I'd picked out in Italy, and smashed it against his own temple. The sound of porcelain shattering was the opening bell for the war they had been planning for months. I watched them with a lawyer's cold eyes, my pulse a steady, thrumming rhythm against the chaos. In the courtroom, you learn that violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, but in a foyer, it's a weapon used to steal the light. "We will stay in the light," I whispered to my mother, Adelaide, as her trembling hands gripped my shirt. I could see the wheels turning in Vesta's mind. They weren't just fighting for the deed to $1 million house. They were gunning for my life's work. In South Carolina, a domestic abuse charge is a scarlet letter for a lawyer. If they could brand me as a violent intruder, they wouldn't just get the mansion. They would erase my ability to ever fight back. Looking back now, I realize that integrity is simply doing the right thing, even when the entire world is being handed a script that says you're the villain. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the neoclassical windows like 1,000 judges' gavels. Vesta collapsed onto the stairs, her breath coming in ragged, practiced gasps. Mordecai stood over the shards of the vase, his face a mask of feigned terror. This was a psychological masterclass. They were weaponizing my own arrival against me, turning a son's homecoming into a violent home invasion. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I didn't let my knuckles whiten any further. Truth is like water. You can try to dam it up, you can try to bury it under a mountain of lies, but it will always find the cracks. It always finds its way back to the surface. That's where the real battle begins. The blue and red distortion of police lights began to bleed through the rain, reflecting off the white pillars of the porch. The sirens died with a low, mournful groan as the cruisers skidded onto the gravel. Vesta didn't wait for them to knock. She threw open the door and collapsed into the arms of the first officer who crossed the threshold. Her performance was terrifying. "Help us, he's crazy. He's trying to kill us for the house," she sobbed, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a woman in the throes of trauma. Mordecai pointed a shaking finger at me, shouting, "He's got the old lady. He's kidnapping her. Look at my head. He hit me with the vase." I didn't move. I didn't shout. I slowly raised my hands, palms open and empty, not in a gesture of surrender, but to show the officers that I was the only stable element in the room. I felt the officers' eyes on me, hard, suspicious, and primed for an arrest. One of them moved toward me, his hand on his holster, while the other checked on Vesta. It was then that I saw the final piece of their trap. Vesta reached into her pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, an ex parte restraining order, already printed and signed by a local judge. It claimed I had been harassing them for months, making threats of violence. She had laid the legal groundwork long before I ever turned onto that driveway. The officers were young, following the primary aggressor protocols that favor the person with visible injuries. Vesta's bleeding cheek and the knot on Mordecai's head were the only evidence they cared about in the heat of the moment. "Andrew, don't," my mother whispered, her voice a tiny thread of hope in the dark. I looked at the officer and spoke with a calm, resonant authority that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Officer, before you proceed, look at the dust on this floor. Look at the filth on my father, Leopold, lying in that hallway. Crime always leaves footprints that no amount of lying can wash away. I am the owner of this home, and I am the one who called you. But the law, in its initial, blunt application, is often blind to the nuance of dust." The cuffs were out. I felt the cold, heavy bite of the steel around my wrists. Vesta's eyes met mine as the metal clicked shut, and, for a fleeting second, the mask of the victim slipped. In its place was a look of pure, predatory triumph. She thought she had won. She thought the golden boy from Boston had been dismantled by a simple Charleston street hustle. Would you have stayed silent, knowing every word you said could be twisted into a rope for your own neck? Sometimes, the loudest thing you can do is say nothing at all and let the enemy think they've won. As they led me toward the front door, the Charleston humidity hit me, thick and suffocating. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at my mother. She was weeping, her small frame looking even smaller against the backdrop of the mansion I'd built for her peace. I gave her a small, reassuring smile, the kind of smile you give a child before a storm. "Don't cry, Mother," I said, my voice steady and full of a profound, unshakable love. "These cuffs are only on my wrists, not my spirit. I am exactly where I need to be to win this for you. Remember that." Mordecai and Vesta stood on the porch, watching the rain wash the blood from Vesta's cheek. Mordecai had his arm around her, the picture of the protective brother-in-law. Vesta didn't scream this time. She just leaned in and mouthed 3 words that echoed louder than the rain. "It's ours now." I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I let the officer guide me into the back of the cruiser. The interior smelled of stale coffee and damp upholstery, a stark contrast to the lemon-scented hallways I'd just left. That was the moment I realized the war wasn't just about a deed. It was about the very soul of what we call family. I sat in the back of that patrol car, the cold steel biting into my skin, and I closed my eyes. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an architect. I began to visualize the legal chessboard, moving the pieces with the same precision I used to design the load-bearing walls of the house. Vesta had declared a war that only one of us would survive professionally, but she had made one fatal mistake. She assumed my strength came from the house. She didn't realize that the strongest structure isn't the one made of marble. It's the one that has been tested by the storm and refused to fall. "Andrew," I whispered to myself, "the game has only just begun." Looking back, that ride to the station was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. I knew the truth was a slow-moving tide, but in Charleston, the tide eventually comes in for everyone. I sat there, listening to the rhythmic click of the rain against the roof, and I started planning. My sister wanted a fight? I would give her a reckoning. I didn't realize it then, but the silence of that cruiser was the necessary breath before the plunge. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart, only to find that the betrayal was the very thing that set you free? The silence of the police cruiser hadn't been an end. It was a sanctuary where I could finally breathe and think. I was released on bail within hours, my professional standing in Boston acting as a temporary shield against Vesta's theatrics. Garrick, my neighbor and a man who spent 30 years in the force, was waiting for me outside the station. He looked at me with eyes that had seen every shade of human depravity. "Andrew, that restraining order is real," he warned, his voice like gravel. If you set foot on that property tonight, they won't just cuff you, they'll bury you. I looked at him, the weight of the night pressing against my chest. I didn't care about the bar association or my career. I felt a life-threatening vibration in my bones. A law that prevents a son from saving his dying father is a law that has lost its moral compass. By 3:30 a.m., the Charleston mist had turned the world into a series of gray, indistinct ghosts. I left Garrick's truck at the edge of the woods and moved through the shadows of the oaks I had planted myself. Vesta thought she controlled the house because she held the keys, but I was the one who designed the load-bearing walls. I knew the architectural blind spots, the places where the security cameras, the ones I had paid for, couldn't see. I moved with the precision of a man breaking into his own heart. It's a bitter irony, isn't it? You build a fortress to keep your parents safe, only to find yourself forced to break into it like a common thief because the enemy is already inside. Success is a hollow victory if the people you love are suffering in the very rooms you bought for their peace. I bypassed the main entrance and slipped through a small, basement-level service door. The air here was colder, smelling of damp concrete and stagnant water. I moved toward the master suite, but the house felt empty. No breathing, no rustle of sheets. My heart hammered as I followed a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from deeper within the foundation. It led me to the storage area, a windowless, narrow cellar meant for seasonal boxes and old luggage. The heavy oak door was locked from the outside with a thick iron bolt that didn't belong in a modern home. My hands shook as I slid the metal back. The door creaked open, revealing a scene that will haunt me until my last breath. My parents, Leopold and Adelaide, were huddled together on a single stained mattress on the floor. There were no pillows, no blankets, just the cold darkness of the shadow room. They looked like castaways in their own home. I dropped to my knees, the dampness of the floor soaking into my suit. "Dad? Mom?" I whispered. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with a terror that only began to soften when she saw it was me. Adelaide didn't scream. She just reached out and gripped my forearm, her fingers like bird bones. Looking back now, I realized that some people don't just steal your property. They try to steal your very right to exist in the sun. But the horror didn't end with the room. I noticed Leopold's insulin kit sitting on top of a stack of boxes near the door. Next to it was a trash bin. I reached in and pulled out several discarded vials, the real, concentrated insulin my father needed to stay alive. In their place on the kit were vials of simple saline and sugar water, expertly relabeled. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. Vesta and Mordecai weren't just neglecting them. They were actively accelerating Leopold's death. They wanted the estate, and they wanted it fast. It wasn't just greed. It was a calculated execution. Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own sibling and realized there was no soul left behind the mask? I didn't roar in rage. Rage is for the weak. I felt a cold, surgical focus settle over me. I knelt beside my father, taking his frail, icy hand in mine. He was slipping away, his breathing shallow and thready. I pulled a water bottle from my jacket and held it to his lips, treating him with the reverence of a priest at an altar. "I'm here, Dad. Andrew is here," I whispered. "The light is coming back. I promise you. Forgiveness is for mistakes, but justice is for the calculated destruction of a soul." I saw the bruises on his wrists where Mordecai must have held him down. In that moment, the son who wanted peace died, and the lawyer who demanded a reckoning was born. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of the room, the mattress, and the swapped vials. This shifted everything. This wasn't a property dispute anymore. This was attempted murder and elder abuse on a felony scale. I wanted to carry them out right then, but I knew Mordecai was armed and Vesta was waiting for me to make a mistake. If I took them now, they'd call the police for a violation of the restraining order before I could get them to a hospital. I had to play a longer, more dangerous game to ensure they never hurt anyone again. The loudest roar doesn't win the hunt. The quietest step does. I looked at my mother, her face illuminated by the dim light of my phone. "Mom, you have to hold on for 48 more hours," I said, my voice as steady as the foundation of the house. "I'm going to end this. I'm going to make sure they never touch you again." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, hidden GPS tracker and a panic button I'd brought from Garrick's stash. I tucked it into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "If they hurt you, press this. Garrick is at the gate. But otherwise, stay silent. Let them think they've won." She nodded, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. I kissed her forehead and then my father's. Feeling the heat of his fever, it burned my lips. I slipped back out into the hallway, the weight of those fake insulin vials in my pocket feeling heavier than the mansion itself. It was the weight of a sister's murderous greed. I moved back through the shadows, disappearing into the Charleston mist just as the first sliver of sun began to bleed through the clouds. My heart was a stone, but my mind was a map. Vesta had built a cage for our parents, but I was about to turn this entire estate into a trap for her. As I slipped away from the basement window, the cool air hit my face, but it didn't soothe the fire inside. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to be the architect of their downfall, stone by stone, lie by lie. The silence of the morning was a promise. Every brick in this house was paid for by my sweat, and every brick was now a witness to their crimes. "Vesta," I whispered to the wind, "you think you own the title, but you've forgotten who built the walls." I didn't realize it then, but the darkness of that cellar was the only place where the truth could finally grow. Have you ever lost everything, only to realize that the loss was the only way to find your true strength? The pre-dawn light over Charleston was a bruised purple, cold and indifferent to the weight of the secrets I carried in my pockets. I stood at the edge of the tree line, my breath hitching in the humid air as I watched a silhouette move near the stone fire pit. It was Mordecai. He was dragging heavy, metal-bound trunks across the grass. The sound of wood scraping on earth felt like a serrated blade against my nerves. I didn't need to see the labels to know what was inside. Those were my mother's personal trunks. They contained the archive of a 50-year marriage, the letters, the hand-stitched baby blankets, the very fabric of our family's history. A person dies twice, I realized, as the first flicker of orange licked the bottom of a trunk. Once when the breath leaves them, and again when the world destroys every trace of the life they lived. Memories are the only currency that doesn't lose value over time, until someone decides to burn the bank. I felt the physical heat of that rising flame as if it were searing my own skin. Vesta wasn't just stealing a mansion. She was systematically erasing the evidence of my parents' lives to pave the way for a narrative where they were unstable and abandoned. Long before she arrived, I gripped my camera, recording every frame of the destruction. I wanted to roar, to sprint across the lawn and tackle Mordecai, but Garrick's voice crackled in my earpiece, cold and grounding. "Stay down, Andrew. You're on thin ice with the law. Witness the pain now to ensure the justice is absolute later." The fire roared to life, a hungry, mindless beast fueled by 50 years of love. Mordecai began tossing photo albums into the center of the pit, the plastic sleeves melting into a toxic black smoke. Suddenly, the basement service door was kicked open with a frantic bang. My mother, Adelaide, had managed to slip out. She didn't run for the gate. She didn't run for me. She ran straight for the fire. It was a desperate, primal movement that broke something deep inside me. She fell to her knees in the dirt, the embers casting a hellish glow on her tear-streaked face, and reached her bare hands into the heat. I watched through the telephoto lens as she pulled out a scorched, half-burnt photograph, a picture of me as a child, standing on my father's shoulders. Mordecai didn't stop her. He just laughed, a dry, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. He kicked a pile of hot ash onto the hem of her nightgown, mocking her useless sentimentality. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. I saw my mother's love in its purest, most agonizing form, risking her life for a scrap of paper that proved her youngest son once belonged to her. I didn't give them a mansion to watch them burn in its yard. I whispered to the shadows, "This ends now." The cruelest fire doesn't destroy the past. It illuminates exactly who needs to be removed from the future. Mordecai thought he was destroying paper, but he was actually fueling the furnace of my resolve. I watched my sister, Vesta, appear on the second-floor balcony, draped in a silk robe I had bought her for Christmas. She looked down like a queen surveying a conquered territory, her face illuminated by the rising sun and the dying fire. "Let it go, Mother," she called out, her voice flat and devoid of any human warmth. "You're a guest here now. Guests don't keep archives." I watched as Mordecai grabbed my mother by the arm and dragged her back toward the basement door. She was still clutching that burnt photograph to her chest, as if it were a holy relic. I didn't move from the tree line, but my expression transformed from grief to a chilling, professional calm. To save her, I realized I had to be more than just a son. I had to be a reckoning. I waited until the door slammed shut and the yard was empty before I stepped out to record the exact location of the ashes. Forensic recovery can do wonders with charred paper, and I intended to use every tool in the modern world to rebuild what they tried to erase. Losing everything is a gift if it finally shows you what is worth keeping. I thought of the white lilies I had dropped in the hallway, likely crushed under Mordecai's boots by now, and I felt a strange sense of clarity. Vesta wanted a war of attrition. I would give her a war of precision. I retreated back into the mist as the sun fully crested the horizon, the mansion standing tall and white, looking like a tombstone for a family that no longer existed. Have you ever stood in the ruins of your own heart and realized that the only way to rebuild was to clear away the rot first? I pulled out my phone and dialed my firm's lead private investigator. "Start the forensic audit on Mordecai's finances," I said, my voice as cold as the morning dew. "I want every debt, every lie, and every shadow he's ever hidden in the dark. If he's burning my mother's past, I'm going to incinerate his future." I looked back one last time at the rising smoke. As the last page of my mother's diary turned into a gray flake of ash and drifted toward the ocean, I realized Vesta hadn't just burned the past. She had ignited a legal napalm that would eventually consume her entire world. I didn't realize it then, but the fire she started would be the very thing that showed me the path home. The morning air in downtown Charleston was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and ancient humidity. But inside the wood-paneled law office, the atmosphere was frozen. I sat across a heavy mahogany table, my colleague Daniel by my side. Every time Vesta shifted in her seat, the expensive silk of her suit rustled, a sound that grated against the silence. She looked radiant, or at least she had paid a lot to look that way, while Mordecai sat beside her, tapping a frantic rhythm on his knee. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. I realized then that, while Vesta was burning the past to build a kingdom, Mordecai was just trying to stay one step ahead of the ghosts. Vesta didn't waste time. She reached into her leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of cream-colored paper across the polished wood. "Andrew, let's stop the theatrics," she said, her voice a smooth, practiced melody. "This is a quitclaim deed, notarized and filed." I leaned forward, the physical weight of the document feeling like a lead weight in the room. It stated that Leopold and Adelaide had sold the $1 million mansion to Vesta for exactly $1, citing love and affection and my continued abandonment as the primary consideration. It was a terrifyingly accurate forgery, or perhaps obtained while they were too sedated to know what they were signing. In that moment, I realized the law is meant to be a shield for the innocent, but in the hands of the greedy, it becomes a scalpel used to cut out the heart of a family. I ran my thumb over the notary seal, feeling the raised edges of a lie. Vesta smirked, leaning back as if she'd already won the final move. She claimed that as the primary caregiver, South Carolina's natural bounty doctrine would protect her from any claim of undue influence. It was a high-stakes legal bluff, designed to make me settle and disappear. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't even raise my voice. I looked at her, my eyes as cold as the marble in that filthy hallway. "A signature is a promise of the soul, Vesta," I said quietly. "You haven't just stolen a house. You've tried to forge the very identity of our parents. That is a debt the universe never forgets." As Vesta began to lecture Daniel on the validity of the filing, I shifted my focus to Mordecai. He was a different kind of wreckage. His brow was slick with sweat, and his phone, sitting face down on the table, wouldn't stop vibrating. Each buzz was a herald of his own private hell. My investigator had pinged me just minutes before. Mordecai had 3 outstanding liens from offshore betting sites, and he had already used this forged deed to apply for a hard money bridge loan from a local predatory lender. He was so desperate for cash to pay off the Charleston collectors that he was ready to sell the mansion out from under Vesta before the ink was even dry on his lies. Greed is a hungry fire. Eventually, it stops eating the wood and starts eating the person who lit it. I felt a strange, cold sense of pity for my sister. She had tied her destiny to a man who would sell her for a winning hand at a poker table. Looking back now, I should have seen the cracks in their alliance sooner. but I was too focused on the structural integrity of my own defense. I watched Mordecai's phone buzz again, the vibration loud enough to rattle the pens on the table. He was a ticking time bomb, and Vesta was sitting right next to the fuse. Have you ever realized that your enemy's greatest weakness wasn't their lack of power, but the person they chose to share it with? Vesta stood up, smoothing her skirt with an air of finality. She threatened to file a permanent restraining order and a defamation suit if I didn't sign a settlement agreement by 5 o'clock. I stood up slowly, the movement calm and deliberate. I leaned across the table, my shadow falling over Mordecai's trembling hands. I know about the collectors, Mordecai, I whispered, just loud enough for the sweat to bead on his upper lip. I wonder if they know you're trying to sell a house you don't actually own. In this city, reputation is everything, but the truth is the only thing that survives the tide. Vesta's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. You're done, Andrew, she hissed. Charleston doesn't care about a Boston lawyer with an ego. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the steady beat of my own heart, a pulse of justice that her greed couldn't stop. We'll see you in court for the emergency guardianship hearing, Vesta, I replied. To defeat a monster, you don't need a bigger sword. You just need to turn on the lights so everyone can see what it really is. I turned and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me like the first beat of a drum. I walked down the sun-drenched sidewalk, the humidity of Charleston finally feeling like it was lifting. I stopped at a small boutique shop on the corner and bought a small, gold-wrapped box of dark chocolate truffles, my mother's favorite. I handed them to Garrick, who was waiting in the car. Smuggle these into the basement, I told him, and tell her the tide is coming in. Tell her it's bringing the truth with it. I didn't realize it then, but that small box of chocolate was more powerful than any deed. It was a message that they hadn't been forgotten. They hadn't been erased. As I watched Mordecai's hands shake while he reached for his phone through the law office window, I realized the mansion wasn't just a home anymore. It was a trap, and the teeth were about to snap shut on both of them. My sister thought she had ignited illegal napalm, but she forgot that I am an architect. I know how to build things that can survive the heat. The silence of the walk back to my car was the necessary space before the storm. Have you ever felt the incredible power that comes from knowing you're the only person in the room who isn't lying? The walk to the Charleston County Courthouse was the longest journey of my life, yet my steps were lighter than they had been in years. The humid morning air felt charged, like the breath before a summer storm. I stood on the stone steps, looking at the massive columns, realizing that while Vesta and Mordecai had used the law as a weapon to fracture our family, I was about to use it as a sanctuary to mend what was left. I wasn't just walking into a guardianship hearing. I was walking into a reclamation of my parents' dignity. Have you ever felt the incredible power that comes from knowing you're the only person in the room who isn't lying? Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was sterile and unforgiving. I sat at the defense table, my fingers interlaced, watching Vesta take the stand. She had traded her silk robes for a modest navy suit, her eyes red-rimmed from practiced tears. She was a masterpiece of deception. She spoke to Judge Miller about her sacrifice, about moving in to save Leopold and Adelaide from my calculated neglect. She presented the forged $1 deed with a steady hand, claiming I was nothing more than a high-priced Boston lawyer who valued property lines over human lives. Looking back now, I should have been furious, but I only felt a cold, surgical focus. A lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is still putting on its shoes, but once the truth arrives, it never leaves. I kept my gaze away from Vesta's smirk and Mordecai's smug posture. Instead, I reached under the table and found my mother's hand. Adelaide was trembling, but as I squeezed her fingers, I felt her pulse begin to steady for the first time since I'd arrived in Charleston. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to let the house speak for itself. Technology isn't just about convenience. It's about accountability. When I built that mansion, I didn't just install marble and cedar. I installed a lifelink system, advanced thermal and biometric sensors embedded within the very drywall for medical monitoring. I had built those walls to listen, and today they were going to testify. Your Honor, I said, standing up as the courtroom lights dimmed. Vesta claims she was a protector. The House begs to differ. I activated the projection on the courtroom screen. The 3D heat map of the foyer appeared, time-stamped from the night of the anniversary. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The judge leaned forward as the map showed a static, cold blue heat signature. My father, Leopold, lying on the marble floor for 6 grueling hours without a single person approaching him. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, 2 bright, warm signatures, Vesta and Mordecai, were shown sitting comfortably, clinking glasses of wine. The biometric data was the final nail. I played the recording of Adelaide's heart rate spiking into the red zone of terror at the exact moment Mordecai's thermal signature loomed over her near the window. These walls didn't just shelter my parents. They witnessed their suffering with a digital memory that couldn't be bribed or forged. Vesta's face transformed from a saintly mask into a pale, crumbling facade of panic. I looked at the bench, my voice echoing with a quiet, terrifying clarity. The law is a shield, but these sensors are the light, and the light shows that my sister didn't move in to care for them. She moved in to watch them fade. But I wasn't finished. I produced the original irrevocable trust document, the one Vesta thought she had bypassed with her forged deed. I pointed to the specific moral exclusion clause I had drafted years ago, a failsafe for the very nightmare we were living. I read it aloud, the words falling like stones into a still pond. If any beneficiary or occupant is found by a court to have committed elder abuse, neglect, or coercion against the residents, their rights to the property are terminated instantly, and they are legally barred from the premises. Vesta's claim to the mansion didn't just evaporate. It became a legal confession of her own downfall. Judge Miller didn't hesitate. The gavel struck the bench like a thunderclap, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. He declared the $1 deed a criminal fraud and ordered the immediate arrest of Mordecai for medical tampering. The swapped insulin vials were now evidence in a felony attempted murder case. I was granted full, immediate guardianship. I looked at Vesta across the aisle. I didn't feel hate. I felt a profound, quiet sadness for the sister I once knew. I didn't exclude you from this house, Vesta, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. Your own choices did. A home is a sanctuary, and you brought poison into the well. The bailiffs moved in, and the theater was finally over. Vesta began to scream about her rights, her voice shrill and hollow, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the closing of the heavy courtroom doors. Mordecai was led away in silence, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. I didn't watch them leave. I turned to my parents, helping Leopold stand from his chair. I felt the air in the room finally clear, the stench of the lie replaced by the scent of old paper and hope. Every step my father took toward the exit was a step away from the shadow room and back into the sun. As we walked out into the bright Charleston afternoon, the light felt different, cleaner, sharper. My arm was around my father's frail shoulders, and my mother walked beside me, her hand tucked into the crook of my elbow. I felt the incredible release of a war won without a single punch thrown. Vesta's reign was over, and the house I built was finally becoming a home again. We didn't need to look back. The truth had arrived, and it was taking us back to the coast. Have you ever realized that the strongest structure you can ever build isn't made of stone, but of the boundaries you set to protect the ones you love? The morning light in Charleston finally felt honest. It didn't cast long, deceptive shadows or hide the grime of neglect. It was a clear, cleansing white that promised a new beginning. As I stood on the porch of the mansion, I realized that the boundaries I had set weren't walls to keep people out, but a sanctuary to keep the love in. I took a breath of the salt-tinged air, feeling the steady rhythm of my heart finally matching the calm of the Atlantic. The truth had arrived, and it was taking us back to the life we were always meant to have. I watched from the porch as the final act of the drama unfolded on the driveway. Vesta and Mordecai were being escorted by sheriff deputies to collect their remaining personal items. This was the silent gauntlet of shame. The neighbors, the local social elite who Vesta had tried so hard to impress, stood on their own lawns in a quiet, collective witness to her fall. There were no cameras, no headlines, just the devastating weight of a community's memory. Mordecai walked with his head down, the criminal investigation into his financial fraud and medical tampering hanging over him like a storm cloud. Vesta's reputation, the only thing she valued as much as the house, was permanently extinguished. As they reached the edge of the property, I stepped down from the porch. I didn't mock them. I didn't need to. I simply handed Mordecai a small, plain envelope. Inside were the receipts for every offshore gambling debt I had quietly paid off over the last week. Not for him, but to ensure the creditors would never have a reason to knock on my parents' door again. Revenge is a fire that consumes the architect along with the building, I said, my voice as calm as the morning tide. I didn't want you to burn, I just wanted you to be gone. I watched them drive away, realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the trash take itself out. Once the driveway was empty, I went back inside. Instead of hiring a professional cleaning crew, I grabbed a bucket of warm, soapy water and a stiff scrub brush. I knelt on the Italian marble in the foyer, right on the spot where I had found my father lying in filth just a week ago. I began to scrub. Every stroke of the brush was a prayer, a ritual of restoration. As the morning sun hit the glass of the front door, it cast a divine, prismatic light across the wet stone. Under the edge of the baseboard, I found something. A small, dusty anniversary card. It was the one I had intended to give them on day one. Humanity isn't found in the grand gestures of building mansions, but in the willingness to kneel and clean them for the people you love. Dad, the floors are clean now, I said as I helped Leopold walk through the foyer an hour later. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but his eyes were clear, the fever of neglect finally broken. Every step you take from here on is on a foundation of love, not fear. Real power is the quiet strength to serve those who once served you. A house is made of wood and stone, but a home is made of the things we are willing to do for one another when the rest of the world isn't watching. Later that afternoon, Andrew, Leopold, and Adelaide stood together in the beachfront garden. We began the slow, rhythmic work of planting new lilies, burying the bulbs deep in the fertile South Carolina soil to replace the ones that had been crushed in the chaos. Garrick joined us, carrying a new, state-of-the-art medical alert system. This time, it wasn't a hidden sensor meant for surveillance. It was a celebrated sign of care that my parents wore with pride. We worked in a comfortable, healing silence, the only sound being the distant crash of the waves and the occasional chirp of a gull. I was turning over a patch of dirt near the cliff's edge when I found it. Mordecai's wedding ring, likely discarded or lost during his frantic exit. I picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy metal in my palm. It represented a union built on greed and a family fractured by envy. I walked to the very edge of the bluff, where the salt spray hit my face, and I flicked the ring into the Atlantic. It vanished into the white foam without a sound. It wasn't an act of anger, it was a ritual of release. Some things are meant to be returned to the depths so that the surface can remain calm. We don't get to choose our shadows, Mom, I said as I sat back down on the porch swing between her and my father. But we do get to choose where we stand in the light. I realized then that my success in Boston, the $1 million, the title on the deed, none of it mattered. The only thing that had weight was the strength I had found to hold the line when the people I loved were being erased. I looked at the lines in my father's face and the softness in my mother's smile, and I knew that the Disan, the legacy, was finally safe. The sun began to set, painting the Charleston coast in shades of gold and deep violet. The mansion glowed like a lighthouse, a beacon of resilience standing tall against the shifting tides. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic creak of the porch swing, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't an architect of buildings. I was an architect of peace. Looking back, the fire that Vesta started didn't destroy us. It just burned away the rot so we could see the stars. They say blood is thicker than water, but I found that the truth is thicker than both. You can't buy a family's love, and you certainly can't steal their dignity. I'm Andrew, and I hope my story reminds you that it's never too late to draw a line in the sand. Peace isn't just a gift, it's a choice you make every single day.